This matter will certainly reach every place touched by the night and day. Allah will not leave a house or residence, but that Allah will cause this religion to enter it, by which the honorable will be honored and the disgraceful will be disgraced. Allah will honor the honorable of Islam, and He will disgrace the disgraceful of unbelief. Islam reached Africa through two gateways, from the east and the north. From both directions, the carriers of Islam navigated across vast empty spaces, the waters of the Indian Ocean and the desert sands of the Sahara. Both ocean and desert, which so often are considered barriers, could be crossed with appropriate means of transportation and navigational skills, and they were, in fact, excellent transmitters of religious and cultural influences. Densely populated lands, on the other hand, functioned as filters, their numerous layers slowing down the infiltration of religious and cultural influences. From Egypt, Islamic influence extended in three directions: through the Red Sea to the eastern coastal areas, up the Nile Valley to Sudan, and across the western desert to the Maghrib. In the 11th century, Arab nomads drove downwards from Egypt to the Sudan and westwards across North Africa. The nomads contributed to the Islamization and Arabization of the Sudan and North Africa. At the same time, Muslim seamen from Egypt and Arabia established commercial centers along the Red Sea and Africa's east coast. By the 12th century, the last indigenous Christians disappeared from North Africa, and by the 15th century, the Christian Coptic population of Egypt itself was reduced to a minority of some 15%. The Christian Nubians, who resisted Muslim expansion for almost 6 centuries, steadily lost ground between the 12th and the 14th centuries. It was only in the Horn of Africa that the power struggle between Islam and Christianity remained undecided. Ethiopia endured as a Christian state even after the number of Muslims had grown considerably. Muslims could not own land and were excluded from higher government offices. On the eastern African coast, Islam faced the challenge of Christianity between the 16th and the 18th centuries. Religion was important in the struggle of Arab and Swahili Muslims. The struggle concluded with the withdrawal of the Portuguese from the coast north of Mozambique after 1698. However, Muslims lost to the Christians the control of the maritime trade in the Indian Ocean. Muslims had dominated this trade for more than 7 centuries, though they had faced competition from Asian Hindus and Buddhists. The Saharan trade, on the other hand, remained completely at the hands of Muslims. Europeans interfered in the Saharan trade only indirectly after the 15th century, when they began diverting some of the gold to the coast. Because Islam spread to West Africa from North Africa, Muslims there followed the Maliki school of law, dominant in North Africa. On the other hand, in East Africa, where Islam came from the Arabian Peninsula, Muslims followed the Shafi'i school of law that prevailed in Arabia. Both regions, however, were exposed to the influence of the Ibadiyya sect. Ibadi merchants opened up trade across the Sahara and were among the first Muslims who reached the Western Sahara as early as the 8th and 9th centuries. But however, converts they had made were converted to Maliki Islam by the 11th century. The Ibadiyya had been established in Eastern Arabia during the first centuries of Islam and became dominant in Zanzibar after the Omani conquest of this island in the 18th century. The Ibadis of Zanzibar maintained their distinct Arab identity and did not engage in missionary work among Africans. The spread of Islam in Africa was much more than the passing on and adoption of religious ideas. As the UNESCO General History of Africa summarizes, summarizes, quote, "Unlike many other faiths, Islam is not only a religion, it is a comprehensive way of life, catering for all the fields of human existence. Islam provides guidance for all aspects of life, individual, social, material, and moral, economic and political, legal and cultural, national and international." Hence, the wave of Islamization across the African continent is not surprising due to the fact that the African people have always been a religious and a spiritual people. It is He who sent His messenger with guidance and the religion of truth to manifest it over all religions, although the polytheists do not like it. Soon after they had defeated the Byzantine imperial forces in the middle of the 7th century, the Muslim Arabs gained control over coastal North Africa. But for some time, the Arabs failed to impose their authority over the Berber tribes of the interior. Successive revolts of the Berbers that forced the Arabs to withdraw were referred to as Ridda, the same term used when Arab tribes deserted the young Muslim community in Medina after the death of the Holy Prophet Muhammad. In both cases, political submission and conversion to Islam were considered one and the same act. Similarly, when the Arabs consolidated their rule over the Berber, the text reads, "After the Islam of the Berber had been made good, Badama Husna Islam al-Berber." The word Islam here carried the two meanings of submission and conversion. The next phase of Berbers' resistance to Arab rule occurred within Islam through adherence to heterodox sects, first the Ibadiyya and then the Ismailiyya. The Al-Murabituns finally secured the victory of Sunni Maliki Islam in the 11th century. Under their Al-Muwahidun successors, Islam in the Maghrib became imbued with the mysticism of the Sufis, who became the principal agents of Islamization in North Africa after the 12th century. Berber-speaking nomads reached the southern Sahara and touched the Sahel in pre-Islamic times. They were well positioned to mediate Islamic influences between the Maghrib and the Western Sahara, known to the Arabs as Bilad Sudan, land of the blacks. As the Berber nomads occupied both shores of the Sahara, the dividing line between white and black Africa, to use French colonial terms, was where the desert meets the Sahel and where Berber-speaking nomads interacted with the Sudanese sedentaries. Along this line, they cooperated in creating the termini of Sahara trade. Today, this dividing line cuts across the modern African states of the Sahel, namely Senegal, Mali, Niger, Chad, and the Sudan. In all these states, except the Sudan, political power is of the black people of the south. It is also only in the Sudan that the dividing line is not only an ethnic but also a religious frontier. As early as the 11th century, Mande-speaking traders, ancestors of the Jula, traveled between the termini of the Sahara routes and the sources of the gold. They created a commercial diaspora based on a shared religion as well as a collective language. A common legal system, the law of Islam, Sharia, even if not strictly observed, contributed to mutual trust among merchants in the long-distance trade. Conversion to Islam became necessary for those who wished to join commercial networks. Although merchants opened routes and exposed isolated societies to external influences, they did not themselves engage in the propagation of Islam. Conversion to Islam was the work of men of religion who communicated primarily with local rulers. The latter often became the first recipients of Islamic influence, an indication to the importance that states had in the process of Islamization. Thus, for some time, Muslims lived under the hospitality of kings, who generally were praised by Muslims for their benevolence towards the believers. This was the situation in 11th century Ghana and in 19th century Ashanti. The process of Islamization advanced when Muslim clerics helped African kings to overcome severe droughts, as in the case of 11th century Malawi, and to secure victory, as in 14th century Kano and in 16th century Gonja. But because only the king and his immediate entourage came under the influence of Islam, the ruling aristocracy adopted a middle position between Islam and the traditional religion, patronizing both Muslim divines and traditional priests. It was through the chiefly courts that Islamic elements filtered the culture to the common people. The symbiotic relations of Islam with the traditional religion has been illustrated in the novel by Ahmadu Koroma, who remarked that everyone publicly proclaimed himself a devout Muslim but privately feared the fetish priests. Muslim clerics who rendered religious services to Islamist chiefs became integrated into the socio-political system of the state by playing roles similar to those of traditional priests. Like traditional priests, Muslim clerics were politically neutral and could therefore act as peacemakers. Mosques, like shrines, were considered sanctuaries where the common people would feel safe. Muslims believe that Allah bestows beneficent power and blessings, barakah, on those closest to Him, clerics and saints, and hence they were trusted to transmit these blessings to devotees and to communities. During long years of training, they are believed to have acquired specialized and hidden knowledge, the ability to know which chapter of the Quran or which verse or a combination of passages to be used at what time and for what purpose required esoteric knowledge, which was only taught to special trusted students in the community. In the great kingdoms of the Sahel, with international trade, Muslim centers of learning, and close connections with the Muslim world, the kings developed greater commitment to Islam. But even these kings, like Mansa Musa of Mali and Askia Muhammad of Songhai, were unable to relieve the monarch of its pre-Islamic heritage. Batuta attested this during his visit to the courts of Mali in the middle of the 14th century, and a scholar from Timbuktu witnessed pre-Islamic customs when he visited the court of Askia Dawood in the middle of the 16th century. Scholars like those of Timbuktu lived as an autonomous community under the leadership of the Qadi, the Muslim judge. Such a community was that of Diaba, the scholars' town, where the king of Mali did not enter. Anyone who entered this town was safe from the king's oppression and his outrage, and it was called the town of Allah. Jealous of their autonomy, proud of their erudition, and committed to follow the law of Islam strictly, the scholars of Timbuktu were not politically neutral, unlike clerics who lived close to chiefly courts. As a result, there were tensions between the scholars of Timbuktu and the political authorities. These scholars were the avowed enemies of Sunni Ali in the middle of the 14th century, and they led the resistance, the Morocco conquest, a century and a half later. There were even tensions between the pious Askia Muhammad and Askia Dawood and the contemporary Qadis. Chiefs used to send their sons to study with Muslim clerics as part of their princely education. These princes were not meant to become Muslims, but some converted and became scholars. The Qadi of Janay in the second half of the 16th century was from among the sons of the chiefs of Kala. He withdrew from authority and became a scholar. Bakari, the son of Biton Kulibali, ruler of the young 18th century Bambara state, became a Muslim. He was deposed and killed because he failed to maintain the delicate balance between Islam and tradition. In 15th century Kano, the king's son, Umar, became a sincere Muslim. When he succeeded his father, the contradiction between being a Muslim and a warrior chief became apparent to him, and he resigned the kingship. He repented during the rest of his life from the wrongdoings he had done as a king. Though they entertained Muslim clerics in their courts, prayed and exhibited some external signs of Islamic influence, the chiefs were not considered Muslims because as warriors they drank alcohol and shed blood. Among the Wolof, tensions developed when the rulers rejected the call of the clerics to repent. To the military and the political elites, repentance or true conversion to Islam implied abandoning their way of life and joining the clerical community. In the Saharan society too, tensions between clerics and the warriors was an important feature. Toward the end of the 17th century, Nasiruddin, a member of a clerical group in the southwestern parts of Mauritania, rebelled against the Banu Hassan warriors, and for a few years the Hassan were on the defensive. Wolof and Fulbe-speaking Muslims joined the jihad of Nasiruddin and succeeded in overthrowing the ruling dynasties of the states of Kayo, Walo, Jolof, and Futa Toro. Within a few years, however, a coalition of the warriors, the traditional political elites from the Sahara and Senegal Valley, with some support from French trading interests, defeated the clerics and regained power. The final victory of the warriors consolidated the division of the Saharan society into two main estates, warriors and clerical clans. The Hassan exercised political and military domination. The Zawaya controlled religious instruction, adjudication, and most of the economic activities in commerce and agriculture. Around Lake Chad, the trade of Kanem to North Africa was mainly in slaves. As a result, Islam did not spread to the lands south of Lake Chad, which remained hunting grounds for slaves. When its power grew, Kanem expanded northwards to the Sahara and as far as Fezzan. In Kanem and its successor state Borno, Islam was not restricted to the court but reached out to the whole population. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Birnin Gazargamo, the capital of Borno, was an important center of Islamic learning. Quranic manuscripts from Borno dating from as early as 17th century had interlinear translations and glosses in the local language. Borno attracted many students from neighboring regions, and Borno scholars officiated as teachers and imams in Hausa land, Yoruba land, Borgu, and further west. By the end of the 18th century, Islam was deeply rooted in the everyday life of the ordinary man in Borno, but even there, pre-Islamic elements persisted, which the Fulbe of Sokoto used as a pretext for the jihad against Borno. The spread of Islam among the Yoruba began in the 19th century and advanced as a result of the fall of the northern Yoruba to the Fulbe Jihad, except in the Emirates of Ilorin, which was part of the Sokoto Caliphate. Islam took root among the Yoruba as a religious practice, but it did not become associated with state tradition. The progress of Islam did not obliterate traditional patterns of authority. Further to the east, on the Nile, Christian Nubians had arrested the advance of Islam for 6 centuries. For about 1500 onwards, 3 major states in the grasslands of the Nubia had developed with a veneer of Islam. In these kingdoms, Funj, Darfur, and Wadai, Islam was corporate and communal. All obedient subjects were considered Muslims, whatever their way of life, while disobedience implied rejection of the corporate Islam of the community, and therefore apostasy. Muslims settled on the Ethiopian coast of the Red Sea as early as the 8th century. By the 9th century, there were Muslim communities along the trade routes to the interior. The town of Harar developed as the most important center of trade and Islamic learning. These communities grew to become Muslim principalities that challenged the hegemony of the Christian Ethiopian state. The most important outcome of the jihad of Imam Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi in the first half of the 16th century was the weakening of both the Christian state and the Muslim principalities. Ahmad bin Ibrahim al-Ghazi was a Somali imam and general of the Adal Sultanate who fought against the Abyssinian Empire with the help of an army overwhelmingly manned by ethnic Somalis, supplemented with the Hadiya, Afars, Hararis, and a small number of Ottoman Arabs and Turks. Imam Ahmed embarked on a conquest which brought 3/4 of Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, under the power of the Muslim sultanates of Adal during the Ethiopian Adal War. The fertile highlands became subject to mass migrations of the pastoral Oromo. By the 18th century, the chiefly families of the Oromo embraced Islam. Muslim religious leaders gained prominence in the Oromo principalities of Ethiopia. Scholars received grants of land to sustain themselves, but they also criticized local rulers and ordinary believers, threatening to avoid performing the proper funeral prayers to those they considered lax in observing Islam. Sufi sheikhs established centers of higher learning, spiritual training, and devotional practice, and made rating contributions to Islamic scholarship. By the middle of the 9th century, Islam also took roots among the Oromo commoners. They fasted, turned to Islamic rather than customary law in matters of marriage and inheritance, paid the zakat, the obligatory tithes, circumcised their sons at an early age than before, and went on Hajj to Mecca. In the 19th century, Muslim traders opened up new regions in the southwestern parts of present-day Ethiopia to procure slaves. Between 1800 and 1830, new Oromo states emerged at the termini of the trade routes from the coast. Sufi teachers who accompanied the trade merchants converted their rulers. While Islam was present on the East Coast as early as 780 Common Era, it became the religion of the majority of the Swahili-speaking peoples between 1200 and 1500. Islam got into contact with East Coast when persecuted Muslims in Mecca, led by Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, the cousin of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, took asylum in the Abyssinian Ethiopian state. Between the 13th and the 16th century, the Swahili also developed a distinct culture. This Swahili Islamic civilization became quintessentially urban. Stone houses, often two-storied, walled off prosperous Swahili Muslims from commoners and encouraged a lifestyle imbued with a special urban elegance. Compared with West Africa, where connections with the heartland of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula were only through Hajj, East Africa, closer geographically, has been in direct and continuous communication with the Arabian Peninsula. In the past 2 centuries at least, boys have been sent to study in Hadramaut and in Mecca and Medina. Direct cultural influences have been detected in music, and in fact whole Arabic instrumental and songs ensembles have been adopted. West African societies, by contrast, have not exhibited such clear Arab musical influences. Until the 19th century, Islam in East Africa remained confined to the coast, unlike in West Africa, where Islam spread far into the interior. Merchants and other settlers on the East Coast were part of the Indian Ocean trading diaspora. Their commercial connections were with lands around the Indian Ocean rather than of the African interior, and to the extent that African goods reached the coast before the 19th century, usually they were carried by traders from the interior, such as the Shona and later the Makua and the Yao. The spread of Islam conveniently took place within a wider context, one of cultural influences and migrations. In West Africa, these movements were in the same direction, from north to south, as that taken by Islam. In East Africa, on the other hand, migrations and movements of goods from the interior to the coast were contrary to the direction Islam would have taken, that is to say, from east to west. In the 19th century, a new class of merchants and landowners with wealth from plantations and trade contributed to religious revival on the East African coast. This new merchant class was responsible for a dramatic increase in the number of mosques and schools, which further augmented the opportunities of employment for men of religion. The more important ulama or scholars spent time in Arabia, mainly in Mecca and Medina. Along with the increasing depth of scholarship, literacy became more popular and widespread due to the growing importance of Sufi brotherhoods in the 19th century. Omani sultans encouraged migration from Hadramaut to the East African coast, but the new arrivals were not assimilated in the Swahili society. For them, the term Swahili implied lower status and even contempt. Those who claimed Arabian origins maintained close ties with their homeland and cultivated what may be described as normative Islam, thus widening the gap with the ordinary Swahili. Mutual estrangement between Swahili and Arabs explains why the former cared nothing for Islamic revivalism. The slow process of Islamization in East Africa beyond the narrow coastal strip started early in the 19th century, when people of the immediate hinterland began frequenting Mombasa with products of the interior. The process was accelerated in the third quarter of the 19th century, when Muslims from the coast settled in farms in the interior, and Africans who had converted in the coastal towns returned to their original rural homes. Islam thus penetrated deep into the interior of East Africa only when Muslim merchants from the coast ventured inland in search for ivory and slaves. Not many Africans accepted Islam along the trading routes and in the settlements of the Arabs and the Swahilis. Those who converted were Muslim members of the immediate entourage of the Arab and the Swahili merchants, spouses and their relatives, hotels, and other employees of the merchants. The Yao are the most Islamized people in the interior of Mozambique and southern Tanzania. Though they had traded with the coast since the 17th century, they were converted only in the 19th century with the coming of traders and scribes to the interior. Matrilineal social principles among the Yao and the Makua created tensions with Islam's patrilineal order. The Makua Sheikh, who had succeeded his matrilineal uncle as Muene or chief elder of his lineage, was obliged to abandon his position in the Qadiriya mystical path or Tariqa, but remained a practicing Muslim. Buganda is the only centralized state in East Africa that might have experienced patterns of Islamization similar to those of kingdoms in West Africa. Kabaka Mutesa came under the influence of Muslim merchants, built mosques, and obliged his chiefs to to pray. Muslims held important positions as heads of provinces and as commanders of the royal guard. The influence of Islam in Buganda was arrested, particularly after the British conquest, because of fierce competition with the Protestant Roman Catholic missionaries. Nevertheless, Bugandan Muslims migrated throughout the region of the Great Lakes and became important agents of conversion well outside their homeland. Islam reached South Africa with free people and slave migration from Malaya and the islands of the Indian Ocean. The process of conversion during the last decades of former slavery between 1798 and 1838 might have constituted South Africa's golden age of Islam. In 1838, manumission among Muslims was faster than among Christians and became a powerful inducement to embrace Islam. Slaves appear to have enjoyed being of a religion opposed to that of their owners. Sufism or Tasawwuf had been a decisive influence on the development and spread of Islam in West Africa. Sufism in West Africa remains understudied and often misunderstood. French and British colonial views of Islam had a lasting impact on the perception of Sufism in Africa, resulting in its depreciation as a kind of popular Islam of the ignorant masses. A closer look at eminent West African Sufi leaders and their movements, including the Qadiriya, the Tijaniya, and the Muridiya, reveals that Sufism articulated itself in a variety of ways over the past centuries, and that it continues to be a formidable spiritual, intellectual, and social force in many countries in the western parts of the African continent, and continue to be the instrument of the spread of Islam in Africa. In the Maghrib, the land of Sufism par excellence, there had been no structured hierarchical brotherhoods, only independent Zawaya or Sufi lodges. In the 16th century, the leading scholars of Timbuktu were Sufis, but like contemporary Egyptian Sufis, they were not affiliated to any Sufi brotherhood or tariqa. Likewise, in Borno, communities were also without tariqa affiliation. In the Sudan, the old brotherhoods of the Qadiriya and the Shadhiliya had been assimilated into local holy clans. The relationship between the sheikh and his followers was direct, face-to-face, and personal, without any further organizational elaboration. There is evidence that the Qadiriya was present in Harar as early as 1500, but oral hagiographic traditions do not associate pre-18th century holy men in the Horn with a particular brotherhood, as they do in regard to holy men who lived after 1800. Rather, holy men are remembered as the founding fathers of various Somali clans. In southern Somalia and East Africa, the affiliation of Sufi communities with a particular tariqa or brotherhood was weak. It was only in the 19th century that named tariqas became important in Somalia. After the 1800s, religious settlements from various clans lived together as ikhwans or brothers, jointly engaged in agriculture, livestock husbandry, and religious study and worship. Along the East Coast, the saint-centered Alawiya brotherhood probably arrived in Pate as early as the 16th century, with the immigration of large numbers of Hadramis from the holy city of Inat and its vicinity. From the island of Pate and the Lamu archipelago, the Alawi Sharifs, those who claim descent from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and sheikhs and their adherents spread southwards along the coast, exerting a tremendous degree of religious prestige and charisma. During the 18th century, there was a meaningful shift in Sufi brotherhoods away from the old patterns of decentralized and diffusive affiliations towards the larger scale and more coherent forms of organization. In the process of restructuring, the role of the sheikh was expanded and brotherhoods became centralized, disciplined organizations that included networks of deputies or khalifas. It is clear from the evidence that the hierarchical, centralized organization of the tariqa was a novelty. Organizational aspects of the brotherhoods, rather than the content of their teaching, rendered them potential political actors. The Qadiriya brotherhood had first been introduced into the Sahara probably at the end of the 15th century, but the Qadiriya had been loosely organized and rather ineffective until its resurgence in the second half of the 18th century under the leadership of Sidi al-Mukhtar al-Hunti. With his religious prestige and acquired wealth from admirers and adherents, he fostered the spiritual chains of the Qadiriya. Sidi al-Mukhtar's emissaries spread the new branch known as Qadiriya Mukhtariya in the Sahara, the Sahel, and as far as Futa Jalon. In the Sudan, the opening up of commercial connections with the Mediterranean and the Red Sea towards the end of the 17th century encouraged the development of towns and the rise of an indigenous, urban-based middle class. The new class needed the stabilizing influence of the Sharia, the rise of literacy in Arabic, public prayers, and conformist dress gave this urban society an entirely new cultural and ethnic identity as Arabs. Observance of the rules of Islam became the criterion to evaluate one's status as a Muslim in the community. The two trends of Islam, the popular Islam of the holy men and the more conformist Islam of the urban population, were brought together by reformed brotherhoods that developed in the Sudan since the last quarter of the 18th century. The new Sufi brotherhoods, the Samaniya, Khatmiya, and Rashidiyya, incorporated local holy families into large-scale organizations. In the Sudan, local scholars and saints were drawn into new and wider networks, which were also inter-ethnic and interregional. Popularly based tariqas reached the East African coast much later. Only near the end of the 19th century did the Qadiriya and the Shadhiliya become active. The Qadiriya attracted some new converts, but its greatest impact seemed to have been to encourage African Muslims to live their faith more enthusiastically and with greater conviction. The Tijaniya Tariqa has become the largest Sufi order in West Africa and continues to expand rapidly. It was brought to southern Mauritania around 789 by Muhammad al-Hafiz al-Shanqiti of the Idao Ali tribe, which was known for its many Islamic scholars and leaders and was predominantly Qadiri at the time. Nearly the entire tribe became Tijani during Muhammad al-Hafiz's lifetime, and the tribe's influence will facilitate the Tijaniya's rapid expansion to sub-Saharan Africa. The disciple or murid of Muhammad al-Hafiz, Sidi Maulud Bal, initiated the 19th century Fulani leader Al-Hajj Umar Tol and the Fulani cleric Abdul Karim An-Naqil from Futa Jalon, modern-day Guinea, into the order. After receiving instruction from Muhammad al-Ghali from 1828 to 1830 in Mecca, Umar Tol was appointed Khalifa of Sidi Ahmed Tijani for all of the Western Sudan or Western Sub-Saharan Africa. Umar Tol then led a holy war against what he saw as corrupt regimes in the area, resulting in a large but fleeting empire in eastern Senegal and Mali. While Umar Tol's political empire soon gave way to French colonialism, the more long-standing result was to spread Islam and the Tijani order through much of what is now Senegal, Guinea, and Mali. In Senegal's whole of country, especially the northern regions of Kajor and Jolof, the Tijaniya Tariqa was spread primarily by Al-Hajj Malik Sai. Born in 1855 near Dagana, in 1902 he founded a religious center or Zawiya in Tiwawan, which became a center for Islamic education and culture under his leadership. Upon Malik Sai's death in 1922, his son Abubakar Sai became the first Khalifa of the order. The Tijaniya Tariqa was spread to the south by another jihadist, Mabba Ba, a contemporary of Umar Tol, who founded a similar Islamic state in Senegal's Saloum area. After Mabba was defeated and killed in battle, his state crumbled, but the Tijaniya remained the predominant Sufi order in the region, and Al-Hajj Abdullah Nias became the most important representative of the order in the Saloum, having immigrated southwards from the Jolof and after exile in Gambia due to tensions with the French, returned to establish a Zawiya in the city of Kaolack. From 1911 onwards, the Senegalese town of Kaolack gradually developed into the headquarters of another branch of the Tijaniya led by Al-Hajj Abdullah Nias. One of his sons, Al-Hajj Ibrahim Nias, initiated a Sufi revival movement that expanded far beyond the confines of Senegal, to which the Muridiyya and the Sai branch of the Tijaniya remained restricted, known as Jama'at al-Faida or the Community of the Divine Flood, and also referred to as Tijaniya Ibrahimiyya. Al-Hajj Ibrahim Nias movement established a presence throughout West Africa, cutting across colonial and later national borders. The word Faida, or in Hausa vernacular Faila, is a derivative of the Arabic term faith that has figured prominently in the Sufi lexicon since the times of Ibn Arabi and can be translated as emanation or divine flood. In 1929, Sheikh Ibrahim Nias proclaimed himself to be the bringer of the faida, thus referring to a prediction of Ahmed Tijani that one day a flood shall come over my companions so that the people will enter our path in thrones. In Ibrahim Anyas's interpretation, this flood meant not only a numerical and geographical expansion of the Tijaniya, but also the proliferation of mystical experiences, drawing on earlier models within and outside the Tijani tradition. Haji Ibrahim Anyas devised a method of spiritual training or tarbiyah that allowed lay members of the Tijaniya to attain experiential knowledge of God or ma'rifah within a very short period of time. This practice stood in contrast with most other Tijani branches, where mystical experiences used to be considered the preserve of a scholarly elite and often took a lifetime to occur, and hence attracted many adherents further south. Graduated students, upon return to their homes, further spread the tentacles of the brotherhood and indirectly Islam among their tribes. Although there were Muslims further south, the northern parts of countries along the Gulf of Guinea, such as Ghana, Togo, Nigeria, Cameroon, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, southern spread of Islam in these countries was mostly carried out by the Tijaniya scholars and their students. Similar to some parts of the north, this later spread was done mostly through preaching and the attraction of the southern tribes to the etiquette or adab of the Muslims. Sheikh Ibrahim Anyas was said to have converted around 4,000 non-Muslims in the town of Tamale in northern Ghana. Such large Tijani conversions became common among several tribes further south. By 1950, tens of millions of Muslims in countries such as present-day Mauritania, Gambia, Guinea, Mali, Niger, Cameroon, Chad, Sudan, Nigeria, Togo, Benin, Ghana, and the Ivory Coast had joined the community of the Divine Flood and recognized Ibrahim Anyas as the Gauth or supreme saint of the time. The colonial period played a decisive role in the history of Islam in Africa. It was the period of the great expansion of the Muslim presence in Africa. This paradox should be borne in mind when, on the scale of the millennium, one draws the balance of this significant period, which extends essentially from the mid-19th century to 1960. At the summit of its empire, France prided itself in being a major Muslim power due to its possessions of the Maghrib, Black Africa, the Middle East. This expression was ambiguous, for under the pretext of recognizing its Muslim subjects, France's interest lay rather in competing with the British Empire by symbolically vying for control over the territory of Islam. Yet, it is precisely the comparison with France's great British rival that permits one to better emphasize the existence of French specificity in Islamic matters. In Africa, for example, in the Sudan and Nigeria, under the doctrine of indirect rule, the British delegated local powers of jurisdiction to the holders of Islamic legitimacy, although under British control. France, for its part, even when it made use of the mediation of the Muslim brotherhoods, often refused to invest them with a recognized legal power. This was not merely a question of different conceptions of colonial policy, but also concerned a particular representation of Islam. On the part of the Muslims, only a minority of Muslim leaders resisted colonialism or tried to avoid conquest by making the hijrah, that is, migrating beyond the reaches of colonial authorities. The majority, however, chose accommodation and collaboration. Public opinion in West Africa was not critical of the elites that collaborated with colonial powers. Indeed, religious leaders sometimes placed the defeated aristocracies as intermediaries with the colonial authorities, as was the case among the Wolof. Jula traders whose trade benefited from the consolidation of colonial rule adopted the same attitude to the new rulers as they had towards the previous non-Muslim rulers. Likewise, the ulama of East Africa protectorates were co-opted into the regime's service as salaries qadis and other native officials. The expansion of Islam accelerated during the colonial period. The opening of routes and railways facilitated the installation of Muslim colonies in South northern regions. In northern Nigeria, the British helped the expansion of Islam by extending the rule of Muslim amirs to neighboring pagan areas. In East Africa, under British and German rule, Muslim trading stations developed into administrative centers where most of the government officials were Muslim. People from the countryside migrated to those growing urban centers like Tabora, where they came under Muslim influence. In Malawi, freedom and security of movements of Muslim traders and clerics facilitated the expansion of Islam, as did the fact that most of the British colonial troops were Muslims. Further into the interior of East Africa, in the eastern provinces of Congo and Burundi and Rwanda, Swahili-speaking Muslims were recruited by Germans to serve as interpreters and soldiers. Their quarters became the nucleus of urban centers, where rural people migrated and settled. The process of mutual assimilation to this new dominant culture took place as the indigenous people converted to Islam while the foreign Muslims adopted the local language. The French colonial administration seems to have cultivated an Islamic policy that changed over time. At first, they encouraged Islam, which they perceived as an advanced stage in the evolutionary process from animism to Western civilization. But when they felt threatened by Islam, the French invented the concept of Islamic neo to distinguish African Islam from Arab Islam. In the 1920s, the French of Sudanese society. Leaders of holy families also became involved in nationalist movements and politics during the joint control of the Muslim states. During the colonial period, the existence of an alternative Muslim educational system insulated the Muslim community from the modernizing tendencies associated with Western education, where Muslims lived close to Christians, as in Lagos, Freetown, Mombasa, Cape Town, and Durban. They organized earlier and more aggressively to create a modern school system that will combine Islamic and Western education. This was the case of the Young Ansaruddin Society, founded in 1923, that established and ran Western schools among Yoruba Muslims. During the colonial period, women took an active part in movements of popular learning and piety. Women, some of them Western educated, devoted time to prayers, learned the Quran, preached to other women, and performed voluntary services. Female participation in Arabic schools is very high, often reaching more than half of the student population. Many women went to Mecca off-season. Hence, the Umrah, which unlike the Hajj may be performed at any time of the year, became known as the women's pilgrimage. Efforts to give women a greater role in religious life were opposed by the reformers. Women responded to the challenge of the fundamentalists by embracing distinctive Muslim dress, including the veil, but at the same time they became more active politically and formed their own organizations. Under the Islamist regime in the Sudan, fewer women enrolled to certain types of medical and technical training. Women became excluded from high-ranking and better salaried positions.